2003 was 20 years ago. Yeah, so you might be wondering what's the point in building a computer using components from 2003, especially given that I already have an Overkill XP rig from 2007 that can easily smash through any game from the XP era. I guess I could sit here and try to make some sort of argument as to why building this PC is important and historically significant or whatever like that, but I'm just gonna be honest with you. I really need an excuse to use all of these parts I have. I'm running out of room and genuinely need some sort of excuse to justify keeping them around, so that's why these are making it into a video. The case we're going to be putting all this stuff in is this lovely little MATX Inwin case. At least I'm assuming this is a real Inwin and not some sort of clone. And given that the build quality is actually really good, with almost all of the edges being folded over, I'm gonna bet that it's a real Inwin. MATX has sort of become the dominant form factor of the modern day, at least when it comes to stuff like OEM systems. But back in the early 2000s, it was a lot less common, and it makes it feel a little bit more special, especially given that in the enthusiast space, full ATX was by far the standard. I'm not sure what this PC was originally used for, but it seems the previous owner needed to get large amounts of data on and off of it fairly frequently. Given the fact it has both an iOmega Rev drive and a removable IDE hard drive caddy. This thing was also very dusty when I got it. Certainly not the worst I've ever seen, but it was still pretty bad. A quick blowing out with the shop vac, and we're ready to see what was left inside the computer. One concerning thing was that the chipset heatsink was barely hanging on to the motherboard and making no contact at all, and fell off at some point during the cleaning. We do at least have an Asus board, which is nice and also has this cool case badge on the front. Unfortunately, the board has no AGP slot, and both RAM slots were each missing a clip for some reason. To make matters even worse, it had a 1.6 GHz Willamette Pentium 4 in it. I genuinely pity whoever had to actually use this thing. Needless to say, this computer seems to have been well used. Not well loved, but certainly very well used. We need to rectify, like, all of this, given that it already had a Pentium 4 in there, and I'd hate to get rid of this Pentium 4 sticker on the front, so we're gonna stick with using a Pentium 4. Now, in all honesty, I'd love to make this an AMD system, either an Athlon XP or Athlon 64, and given that the later launched in 2003, it would make sense, but that would require me to buy more components, which is kinda going against the main point of this. Now, it's not like the Pentium 4 was that bad, especially not during this era, so I picked out the best Northwood chip I have, which is clocked at 3.2 GHz. This chip does have hyper-threading, however, I'll touch on that a little bit more later. This should be pretty much on par with AMD's offerings at the time, and was one of the best CPUs Intel had to offer in 2003, of course excluding the Pentium 4 Extreme Edition. And I just so happen to have this nice MATX Asus motherboard to pair with it, so we also get to keep that Asus badge on the front as well. I suspect that this board is probably not from 2003, it's more likely from around 2004, but I'm not going to really sweat it too much. It has the Intel 865 chipset, a very solid, reliable chipset for Pentium 4s, and I'm going to be honest, if you're looking to build a socket 478 Pentium 4, I wouldn't even really bother with other chipsets unless you want to get really specific. This board has most of the features you could want from this time: built-in Ethernet, USB 2.0, FireWire, an AGP slot, and even 2 SATA connectors, which help make it feel fairly modern. This all seems to be looking like a great board, and it is, except for one very big, massive flaw. See, this board actually comes out of an HP, or, well, a compact to be more specific, but that's besides the point. Now, I'll save my comments on HP for now, and given that the board was manufactured by Asus, the build quality is at least decent. The BIOS, however, is extremely stripped down and allows for very little customization when it comes to performance or anything really. As far as I know, this board was exclusive to HP, meaning that there's not some sort of regular Asus BIOS I could attempt flashing onto it. So it is rather disappointing, especially since there's no way to disable hyperthreading. I had originally planned on using 1GB of RAM for this project, but I decided to test out the 400MHz DDR Kingston RAM that was already included in the machine. Turns out that it's actually a 2GB kit, which makes me even more curious as to what this computer was used for in its previous life. Well, since I have the 2GB of RAM, I might as well use it, even though it would have been pretty overkill for 2003. I had this brand new Intel stock heatsink lying around, and that should be perfectly fine, but then I remembered I had this other socket 478 heatsink, which is literally just a massive hunk of copper. Seriously, this thing must weigh a solid 3 or 4 pounds, and has got to be worth at least $10 in just the scrap metal alone. Either way, the P4 is going to be running nice and cool with it, especially because I strapped this 80mm Foxconn fan to it, which can go up to 0.65 amps. I did this just to be funny, frankly, and also because I didn't have the original fan that goes with the heatsink. Since this is turning out to be a pretty high-end system, we kinda need to pick a high-end GPU to go with it. Luckily, I happened to find, after many years of waiting, one of the most legendary cards of the early 2000s, the ATI Radeon 9800 Pro. This one specifically is actually the All-in-Wonder variant, which means it has a built-in TV tuner and some other funky inputs and outputs. But aside from that, it's just a normal 9800 Pro. Well, it's actually not quite the same, as both the core and the memory have been downclocked by 2 MHz for some reason. Really not that big of a deal, and it's certainly not as bad as older All-in-Wonder cards, such as the 8500 All-in-Wonder, which was clocked significantly lower than a standard 8500. I'm sure the sound that's already built onto the motherboard is probably fine enough, but onboard audio was not typically known for being the greatest back then, and since I already have it, Audigy 2 ZS. Now, I'm pretty sure that the ZS is actually from like 2004, but honestly, who cares? It's not that different from an original Audigy 2 to warrant worrying about. Now, on the topic of drives, I decided to keep the Rev drive in there. It serves me literally no purpose, since I have no cartridges for it, and the drive is probably dead anyways. But it fills the hole nicely, so why not keep it in there? And to fill the other 3.5-inch bay, I'm putting in a Zip 250 drive. I probably won't use it a lot either, but at least with the zip drive, I could get some use out of it, since I have a few zip disks lying around. I didn't bother testing the DVD drive that was already in there, since I wanted to swap it out with a black DVD drive to match the rest of the drives. Unfortunately, the few black IDE drives I do have all refused to work, so I resorted to using a SATA optical drive because, for some reason, every SATA drive I have works perfectly fine, while all of my IDE ones seem to be dropping like flies lately. Does anyone else notice this pattern, or is it just like a weird thing with me and just having really bad luck? And that original removable IDE caddy, well, since I don't have the caddy for it, it's practically useless, plus the door was broken on it. Finding a replacement caddy, it would be basically impossible, so might as well just get rid of it. I do happen to have, however, a very similar device made by Promise. This is intended to be hot swappable in conjunction with a Promise IDE controller, but you can use it just fine without one, assuming you don't want to use the hot swap feature. I put an 80GB drive in the caddy, so that way I can put less demanding games and anything else on it, and keep a few high-performance games and the OS on the real star of the show. An original 36GB Western Digital 10,000 RPM Raptor drive. This was one of the first high-performance hard drives aimed at the consumer market. Before this, if you wanted high performance, you needed to go buy a more expensive SCSI drive, plus a SCSI controller, or do some sort of IDE RAID. The Raptor simplified this a lot. As long as you had a SATA controller, you could enjoy the sweet sounds of a 10,000 RPM drive right in your own home. The Roseville power supply that was already in the case would have probably been fine, but no, I'm gonna go grab another power supply. I pulled this nice Antec True Power 480 watt power supply off of my shelf. After passing a quick voltage test and determining that it was fine, I put it in the system. Everything was working perfectly fine the night I was getting the hardware set up. I had decided to wait on installing Windows until the morning. The morning rolled around and nothing. Literally nothing. Only an extremely brief blip from the power LED. I, nor anything, had touched the computer at all during the night, and I was seriously starting to consider the possibility that the motherboard had just up and died somehow. However, I grabbed a modern 650 watt Corsair power supply, and lo and behold, everything started working again. Upon inspecting the Antec, there was some pretty obviously bulging capacitors that I hadn't noticed before. Not sure why it worked perfectly fine at first, and then after it was disconnected from power, it then decided to die. But the moral of the story is that you can never trust an old power supply, even from a reputable brand. I'm just thankful it didn't catastrophically fail and take out the whole computer with it. And that basically does it for the hardware. I think we have here a pretty good 2003 to 2004-ish computer that should be able to play most early to mid-2000s games just fine. I was initially toying with the idea of putting Windows 2000 on here, especially since I already have an XP machine. And while I love Windows 2000 a lot, I must admit it can be a bit of a pain at time getting things to play nicely with it. So I decided to go with Windows XP, but instead of going with Service Pack 3 like everyone else does, I figured I'd try out Service Pack 1. I quickly realized, though, this was going to be a bit of a limitation, being stuck with Service Pack 1, so I upgraded to Service Pack 2, which, in my opinion, is where XP really came into its own and actually kind of started being good, and is what I primarily used back in the day. I didn't really pick any specific drivers, I just kind of went with what the latest ones available were, which thankfully in this case, especially for the Radeon 9800, are actually pretty good, despite the latest drivers for that coming out in 2010, a full 7 years after the card launched. Now that I've been playing around with this machine over the past week or two, what has the experience been like? I would overall say it's been pretty good. Most of the games from 2003 and before have no issues running at all. It's when you start getting into games from 2004 and newer that the limitations really start to show through. The GPU actually has a lot of oomph to give in these demanding games, which is one of the reasons why it was so legendary. That Pentium 4 is what's really holding us back. A Pentium 4 Extreme Edition would likely be faring better, but I seriously doubt this HP BIOS would be happy with one of those. But by 2004, people who were looking for high-end gaming performance were looking at the Athlon 64. Unless they were a die-hard Intel fanboy, there was just no reason to really buy one of these. That's not to say this P4 is outright bad and that newer games are unplayable or anything like that. It's just that technology and games were advancing so rapidly back then that you could have a fairly high-end system from the previous year, and by the next year, it would already be struggling to play the latest games. Coupled with the fact that NetBurst was already a pretty flawed architecture, it's not really surprising to see these kinds of results. Despite all of this, you can still play most of the big XP-era games from 2001 to 2005, while having all of them be relatively playable. You just need to keep your expectations in check. A few other side notes, the first one being the insane heat this thing can kick out sometimes. This has more to do with the fact that the ventilation is not the greatest on this case, so the heat likes to concentrate itself inside the computer. I ended up swapping to a more powerful 80mm exhaust fan and ditching the Noctua I was using originally. It is still a little concerning how hot the power supply gets. Half of the CPU heat is getting blown directly into the power supply, and it makes it a lot warmer than I'd like. But there's not really much I can do about it, so I'm just gonna have to live with it. So was all of this even worth my time in getting set up? Aside from the power supply issues at first, it actually turned out to be quite an easy project to put together. It's been fun finally getting to mess around with my 9800 Pro, as well as seeing how well games run on a Pentium 4. With that said, I can't say I'd really recommend you go out of your way to build a machine like this, unless you already have a collection of parts from this time, or you just have a lot of nostalgia for this specific time in history. Picking a Pentium 4 just doesn't make a whole lot of sense for an XP gaming box. You could improve it by pairing the 9800 with an Athlon 64, which would give you an extra boost in these later titles, but if you don't care about the nostalgia or anything like that and don't already have these parts, going with something like a Core 2 or a later Athlon system with PCI Express is going to be a lot easier and cheaper to buy into, not to mention a lot more powerful as well. If you do plan on building a system like this, however, I'd say just enjoy it for what it is. Enjoy the flaws, the heat, and the noise, because this was a time when PC building was ever rapidly changing, and though your computer was left in the dust within 6 months, you still enjoyed it regardless, because you had a gaming PC, and that's all that really mattered. Thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to end off this video with just the next couple minutes being some gameplay footage off the computer. So, hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll see you guys in the next video.
Notice that they have a sound enhancer and movement tracker. Dr. Krieger has fitted everyone on the island with locator signals that you can track using the binocs. Try to acquire one of their vehicles and drive to the helicopter refueling pad. It's on the other side of the island. From there, you can use one of their boats to escape.
I'm gonna mess you up! Someone's there?
Welcome. Welcome to City 17. You have chosen, or been chosen, to relocate to one of our finest remaining urban centers.
Were you the only ones on that train?
Right, I'm moving.
17 that I elected to establish my administration here, in the citadel so thoughtfully provided by our benefactors. I've been proud to call City 17 my home. And so, whether you are here to stay or passing through on your way to parts unknown, welcome to City 17.
Silencers attached. Careful, new men. Enemy contact up ahead. We spotted KPA patrols down on the beach. Use your binocs to tag them before you run in blind.
I see a large transmitting array. That must be the jamming station.
Energy critical. Maximum